Louis XVI of France.
Louis XVI was King of France and Navarre from 1774 until 1791, after which he was subsequently King of the French from 1791 to 1792, before his deposition and execution during the French Revolution. His father, Louis, Dauphin of France, was the son and heir apparent of Louis XV of France. As a result of the Dauphin's death in 1765, Louis succeeded his grandfather in 1774. The first part of Louis' reign was marked by attempts to reform France in accordance with Enlightenment ideals. These included efforts to abolish serfdom, remove the taille, and increase tolerance toward non-Catholics. The French nobility reacted to the proposed reforms with hostility, and successfully opposed their implementation. Increased discontent among the common people ensued. From 1776 Louis XVI actively supported the North American colonists, who were seeking their independence from Great Britain, which was realized in the 1783 Treaty of Paris. The ensuing debt and financial crisis contributed to the unpopularity of the Ancien regime, which culminated at the Estates General of 1789. Discontent among the members of France's middle and lower classes resulted in strengthened opposition to the French aristocracy and to the absolute monarchy, of which Louis and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, were viewed as representatives. In 1789, the storming of the Bastille during riots in Paris marked the beginning of the French Revolution. Louis's indecisiveness and conservatism led some elements of the people of France to view him as a symbol of the perceived tyranny of the Ancien regime, and his popularity deteriorated progressively. His disastrous flight to Varennes in June 1791, 4 months before the constitutional monarchy was declared, seemed to justify the rumors that the king tied his hopes of political salvation to the prospects of foreign invasion. The credibility of the king was deeply undermined, and the abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of a republic became an ever-increasing possibility. In a context of civil and international war, Louis XVI was suspended and arrested at the time of the insurrection of August 10, 1792, 1 month before the constitutional monarchy was abolished in the First French Republic proclaimed on September 21, 1792. He was tried by the National Convention, self-instituted as a tribunal for the occasion, found guilty of high treason, and executed by guillotine on January 21, 1793 as a desacralized French citizen known as Citizen Louis Capet, a nickname in reference to Hugh Capet, the founder of the Capetian dynasty, which the revolutionaries interpreted as Louis' family name. Louis XVI is the only king of France ever to be executed, and his death brought an end to more than 1,000 years of continuous French monarchy.
Childhood.
Louis Auguste of France, who was given the title Duc de Berry at birth, was born in the Palace of Versailles. Out of 7 children, he was the third son of Louis, the Dauphin of France, and thus the grandson of Louis XV of France and of his consort, Marie Olsztyńska. His mother was Marie Joseph of Saxony, the daughter of Frederick Augustus II of Saxony, Prince-Elector of Saxony and King of Poland. Louis Auguste had a difficult childhood because his parents neglected him in favor of his, said to be, bright and handsome older brother, Louis, Duc de Bourgogne, who died at the age of 9 in 1761. A strong and healthy boy, but very shy, Louis Auguste excelled in his studies and had a strong taste for Latin, history, geography, and astronomy, and became fluent in Italian and English. He enjoyed physical activities such as hunting with his grandfather, and rough playing with his younger brothers, Louis Stanislas, Comte de Provence, and Charles Philippe, Comte de Troyes. From an early age, Louis Auguste had been encouraged in another of his hobbies, locksmithing, which was seen as a useful pursuit for a child. Upon the death of his father, who died of tuberculosis on December 20, 1765, the 11-year-old Louis Auguste became the new Dauphin. His mother never recovered from the loss of her husband, and died on March 13, 1767, also from tuberculosis. The strict and conservative education he received from the Duc de la Vallée-Guyon, Gouverneur des Enfants de France, Governor of the Children of France, from 1760 until his marriage in 1770, did not prepare him for the throne that he was to inherit in 1774 after the death of his grandfather, Louis XV. Throughout his education, Louis Auguste received a mixture of studies particular to religion, morality, and humanities. His instructors may have also had a good hand in shaping Louis Auguste into the indecisive king that he became. Abbé Berthier, his instructor, taught him that timidity was a value in strong monarchs, and Abbé Soldini, his confessor, instructed him not to let people read his mind.
Family life.
On May 16, 1770, at the age of 15, Louis Auguste married the 14-year-old Habsburg Archduchess Maria Antonia, better known by the French form of her name, Marie Antoinette, his second cousin once removed and the youngest daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Francis I and his wife, the formidable Empress Maria Theresa. This marriage was met with some hostility by the French public. France's alliance with Austria had pulled the country into the disastrous 7 Years' War, in which it was defeated by the British, both in Europe and in North America. By the time that Louis Auguste and Marie Antoinette were married, the French people generally regarded the Austrian alliance with dislike, and Marie Antoinette was seen as an unwelcome foreigner. For the young couple, the marriage was initially amiable but distant. Louis Auguste's shines and, among other factors, the young age and inexperience of the newlyweds, who were near total strangers to each other, having met only 2 days prior to their wedding, meant that the 15-year-old bridegroom failed to consummate the union with his 14-year-old bride. His fear of being manipulated by her for imperial purposes caused him to behave coldly towards her in public. Over time, the couple became closer, though while their marriage was reportedly consummated in July 1773, it was not in fact really so until 1777. Nevertheless, the royal couple failed to produce any children for several years after their wedding, placing a strain upon their marriage, whilst the situation was worsened by the publication of obscene pamphlets, libels, which mocked the infertility of the pair. One questioned, "Can the king do it? Can't the king do it?" The reasons behind the couple's initial failure to have children were debated at that time, and they have continued to be so since. One suggestion is that Louis Auguste suffered from a physiological dysfunction, most often thought to be phimosis, a suggestion first made in late 1772 by the royal doctors. Historians adhering to this view suggest that he was circumcised, a common treatment for phimosis, to relieve the condition 7 years after their marriage. Louis's doctors were not in favor of the surgery. The operation was delicate and traumatic, and capable of doing as much harm as good to an adult male. The argument for phimosis and a resulting operation is mostly seen to originate from Stefan Zweig, who is now known to have given undue prominence to evidence suggesting that Louis had phimosis, and to have suppressed other evidence that contradicted that interpretation. Zweig, a novelist not an historian, was influenced by the theories of his close friend Sigmund Freud, and argued that Antoinette's notorious frivolity and spendthrift ways resulted from her sexual frustration in the first 7 years of her marriage. Most modern historians agree that Louis had no surgery. For instance, as late as 1777, the Prussian envoy, Baron Gulls, reported that the King of France had definitely declined the operation. The fact was that Louis was frequently declared to be perfectly fit for sexual intercourse, confirmed by Joseph II, and during the time he was purported to have had the operation, he went out hunting almost every day, according to his journal. This would not have been possible if he had undergone a circumcision. At the very least, he would have been unable to ride to the hunt for a few weeks thereafter. The couple's consummation problems are now attributed to other factors. Antonia Fraser's biography of the Queen discusses Joseph II's letter on the matter to one of his brothers after he visited Versailles in 1777. In the letter, Joseph describes in astonishingly frank detail Louis' inadequate performance in the marriage bed and Antoinette's disinterest in conjugal activity. Joseph described the couple as complete fumblers, but with his advice, Louis began to apply himself more effectively to his duties as a husband, and sometime in the third week of August 1777 Marie Antoinette finally became the true Queen of France. In spite of all their earlier difficulty, the royal couple became the parents of 4 children. Antonia Fraser also refers to a miscarriage the Queen seems to have suffered in July 1779, and another in early November 1783. The 4 live-born children were Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, December 19, 1778 – October 19, 1851, Louis-Joseph Xavier François, the Dauphin, October 22, 1781 – June 4, 1789, Louis Charles, the future titular King Louis XVII of France, March 27, 1785 – June 8, 1795, Sophie Helene Beatrix, who died in infancy, July 9, 1786 – June 19, 1787.
Absolute monarch of France, 1774 to 1788.
When Louis XVI succeeded to the throne in 1774, he was 19 years old. He had an enormous responsibility, as the government was deeply in debt, and resentment to despotic monarchy was on the rise. Louis also felt woefully unqualified for the job. As king, Louis focused primarily on religious uniformity and foreign policy. While none doubted Louis's intellectual ability to rule France, it was quite clear that, although raised as the Dauphin since 1765, he lacked firmness and decisiveness. His desire to be loved by his people is evident in the prefaces of many of his edicts that would often explain the nature and good intention of his actions as benefiting the people. He aimed to earn the love of his people by reinstating the parliaments. When questioned about his decision, he said, "It may be considered politically unwise, but it seems to me to be the general wish and I want to be loved." In spite of his indecisiveness, Louis XVI was determined to be a good king, stating that he must always consult public opinion. It is never wrong. He therefore appointed an experienced advisor, Jean-Frédéric Philippot, Comte de Maurepas who, until his death in 1781, would take charge of many important ministerial functions. Among the major events of Louis XVI's reign was his signing of the Edict of Versailles, also known as the Edict of Tolerance, on November 7, 1787, which was registered in the Parliament on January 29, 1788. This edict effectively nullified the Edict of Fontainebleau that had been law for 102 years. It granted non-Catholics, Calvinists, Huguenots, Lutherans, as well as Jews, civil and legal status in France, and gave them the right to openly practice their faiths. The Edict of Versailles did not legally proclaim freedom of religion in France. This took 2 more years, with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen of 1789. However, it was an important step in eliminating religious tensions and it officially ended religious persecution within his realm. Radical financial reforms by Turgot and Malesherbes angered the nobles and were blocked by the parliaments who insisted that the king did not have the legal right to levy new taxes. So, in 1776, Turgot was dismissed and Malesherbes resigned, to be replaced by Jacques Necker. Necker supported the American Revolution, and he carried out a policy of taking out large international loans instead of raising taxes. He attempted to gain public favor in 1781 when he had published the first ever statement of the French crown's expenses and accounts, the Compte rendu au roi. This allowed the people of France to view the king's accounts in modest surplus. When this policy failed miserably, Louis dismissed him, and then replaced him in 1783 with Charles Alexander de Calonne, who increased public spending to buy the country's way out of debt. Again this failed, so Louis convoked the Assembly of Notables in 1787 to discuss a revolutionary new fiscal reform proposed by Calonne. When the nobles were informed of the extent of the debt, they were shocked into rejecting the plan. This negative turn of events signaled to Louis that he had lost the ability to rule as an absolute monarch, and he fell into depression. As power drifted from him, there were increasingly loud calls for him to convoke the Estates General, which had not met since 1614, at the beginning of the reign of Louis XIII. As a last-ditch attempt to get new monetary reforms approved, Louis XVI convoked the Estates General on August 8, 1788, setting the date of their opening at May 1, 1789. With the convocation of the Estates General, as in many other instances during his reign, Louis placed his reputation and public image in the hands of those who were perhaps not as sensitive to the desires of the French public as he was. because it had been so long since the Estates General had been convened, there was some debate as to which procedures should be followed. Ultimately, the Parlement de Paris agreed that all traditional observances should be carefully maintained to avoid the impression that the Estates General could make things up as it went along. Under this decision, the king agreed to retain many of the divisionary customs which had been the norm in 1614, but which were intolerable to a third estate buoyed by the recent proclamations of equality. For example, the first and second estates proceeded into the assembly wearing their finest garments, while the third estate was required to wear plain, oppressively sombre black, an act of alienation that Louis would likely have not condoned. He seemed to regard the deputies of the Estates General with at least respect. In a wave of self-important patriotism, members of the estates refused to remove their hats in the king's presence, so Louis removed his to them. This convocation was one of the events that transformed the general economic and political malaise of the country into the French Revolution. In June 1789, the Third Estate unilaterally declared itself the National Assembly. Louis's attempts to control it resulted in the tennis court oath, Serment du Jeu de Paume, on June 20, the declaration of the National Constituent Assembly on July 9, and eventually led to the storming of the Bastille on July 14, which started the French Revolution. Within 3 short months, the majority of the king's executive authority had been transferred to the elected representatives of the people's nation.
Foreign policy.
French involvement in the 7 Years' War had left Louis XVI a disastrous inheritance. Britain's victories had seen them capture most of France's colonial territories. While some were returned to France at the 1763 Treaty of Paris, a vast swathe of North America was ceded to the British. This had led to a strategy amongst the French leadership of seeking to rebuild the French military in order to fight a war of revenge against Britain, in which it was hoped the lost colonies could be recovered. France still maintained a strong influence in the West Indies, and in India maintained 5 trading posts, leaving opportunities for disputes and power play with Great Britain.
Concerning the American Revolution.
In the spring of 1776, Vergennes, the Foreign Secretary, saw an opportunity to humiliate France's long-standing enemy, Great Britain, as well as recover territory lost during the 7 Years' War, by supporting the American Revolution. Louis XVI was convinced by Pierre Beaumarchais to secretly send supplies, ammunition and guns from 1776, sign a formal treaty of alliance in early 1778, and go to war with Britain. Spain and the Netherlands soon joined the French in an anti-British coalition. After 1778, Britain switched its focus to the West Indies, as defending the Sugar Islands was considered more important than trying to recover the 13 colonies. France and Spain planned to invade the British Isles with the Armada of 1779, but the operation never went ahead. France's initial military assistance to the American rebels was a disappointment with defeats at Rhode Island and Savannah. In 1780, France sent Rochambeau and de Grasse to help the Americans, along with large land and naval forces. The French Expeditionary Force arrived in North America in July 1780. The appearance of French fleets in the Caribbean was followed by the capture of a number of the Sugar Islands, including Tobago and Grenada. In October 1781, the French naval blockade was instrumental in forcing a British army under Lord Cornwallis to surrender at the Siege of Yorktown. When news of this reached London, the government of Lord North fell in March 1782 and Great Britain immediately sued for peace terms. However, France delayed the end of the war until September 1783 in the hope of overrunning more British colonies in India and the West Indies. Great Britain recognized the independence of the 13 colonies as the United States of America, and the French War Ministry rebuilt the army. However, the British defeated the main French fleet in 1782 and successfully defended Jamaica and Gibraltar. France gained little from the 1783 Treaty of Paris that ended the war, except the colonies of Tobago and Senegal. Louis XVI was wholly disappointed in his aims of recovering Canada, India and other islands in the West Indies from Britain, as they were too well defended and the Royal Navy made any invasion attempt impossible. The war cost 1,066 million livres, financed by new loans at high interest, with no new taxes. Necker concealed the crisis from the public by explaining only that ordinary revenues exceeded ordinary expenses, and not mentioning the loans. After he was forced from office in 1781, new taxes were levied.
Concerning India,
Louis XVI hoped to use the American Revolutionary War as an opportunity to expel the British from India. In 1782, he sealed an alliance with the Peshwa Madhu Rao Narayan. As a consequence, Bussy moved his troops to the Isle de France, now Mauritius, and later contributed to the French effort in India in 1783. Suffren became the ally of Hyder Ali in the Second Anglo-Mysore War against British rule in India, in 1782 to 1783, fighting the British fleet along the coasts of India and Ceylon.
concerning Vietnam and Indochina,
France also intervened in Cochinchina following manager Picnou de Behane's intervention to obtain military aid. A France-Cochinchina alliance was signed through the Treaty of Versailles of 1787, between Louis XVI and Prince Nguyen. As the French regime was under considerable strain, France was unable to follow through with the application of the treaty, but manager Picnou de Behane persisted in his efforts and with the support of French individuals and traders mounted a force of French soldiers and officers that would contribute to the modernization of the armies of Nguyen, contributing to his victory and his reconquest of all of Vietnam by 1802.
concerning world exploration,
Louis XVI also encouraged major voyages of exploration. In 1785, he appointed La France to lead a sailing expedition around the world.
Revolutionary Constitutional Reign, 1789 to 1792.
On October 5, 1789, an angry mob of Parisian working women was incited by revolutionaries and marched on the Palace of Versailles, where the royal family lived. At dawn, they infiltrated the palace and attempted to kill the Queen, who was associated with a frivolous lifestyle that symbolized much that was despised about the Ancien regime. After the situation had been diffused by Lafayette, who was leading the Garde Nationale, the king and his family were brought by the crowd to the Tuileries Palace in Paris. The reasoning behind this forced departure from Versailles was the opinion the king would be more accountable to the people if he lived among them in Paris. The Revolution's principles of popular sovereignty, though central to democratic principles of later eras, marked a decisive break from the absolute monarchical principle that was at the heart of traditional French government. As a result, the revolution was opposed by many of the rural people of France and by practically all the governments of France's neighbors. As the revolution became more radical and the masses became more uncontrollable, several leading figures in the initial formation of the revolution began to doubt its benefits. Some, like Henri Mirabeau, secretly plotted with the crown to restore its power in a new constitutional form. Beginning in 1791, Montmorin, Minister of Foreign Affairs, started to organize covert resistance to the revolutionary forces. Thus, the funds of the civil list, la liste civile, voted annually by the National Assembly were partially assigned to secret expenses in order to preserve the monarchy. Arnauld Laporte was in charge of the civil list and he collaborated with both Montmorin and Mirabeau. After the sudden death of Mirabeau, Maximilien Radix de Saint-Foix, a noted financier, took his place. In effect, he headed a secret council of advisers to the king that tried to preserve the monarchy. These schemes proved unsuccessful, and were exposed later as the Armoire de Fer scandal. Mirabeau's death, and Louis's indecision, fatally weakened negotiations between the crown and moderate politicians. On one hand, Louis was nowhere near as reactionary as his brothers, the Comte de Provence and the Comte de Troyes, and he repeatedly sent messages to them requesting a halt to their attempts to launch counter-coups. This was often done through his secretly nominated regent, the Cardinal Lomnie de Brienne. On the other hand, Louis was alienated from the new democratic government both by its negative reaction to the traditional role of the monarch and in its treatment of him and his family. He was particularly irked by being kept essentially as a prisoner in the Tuileries, and by the refusal of the new regime to allow him to have confessors and priests of his choice rather than constitutional priests pledged to the state and not the Roman Catholic Church.
Flight to Varennes 1791.
On June 21, 1791, Louis XVI attempted to secretly flee with his family from Paris to the royalist fortress town of Montmédy on the northeastern border of France, where he would join the émigrés and be protected by Austria. While the National Assembly worked painstakingly towards a constitution, Louis and Marie Antoinette were involved in plans of their own. Louis had appointed the Baron de Breteuil to act as plenipotentiary, dealing with other foreign heads of state in an attempt to bring about a counter-revolution. Louis himself held reservations against depending on foreign assistance. Like his mother and father, he thought that the Austrians were treacherous and the Prussians were overly ambitious. As tensions in Paris rose and he was pressured to accept measures from the Assembly against his will, Louis XVI and the Queen plotted to secretly escape from France. Beyond escape, they hoped to raise an armed congress with the help of the émigrés, as well as assistance from other nations with which they could return and, in essence, recapture France. This degree of planning reveals Louis' political determination. Unfortunately, it was for this determined plot that he was eventually convicted of high treason. However, his indecision and misunderstanding of France were responsible for the failure of the escape. The royal family was arrested at Varennes-en-Argonne shortly after Jean-Baptiste Drouet, who recognized the king from his profile on a 50-livre assignat, paper money, had given the alert. Louis XVI and his family were taken back to Paris where they arrived on June 25. Viewed suspiciously as traitors, they were placed under tight house arrest upon their return to the Tuileries. At the microscopic level, the failure of the escape plans was due to a series of misadventures, delays, misinterpretations, and poor judgments. In a wider perspective, the failure was attributable to the king's indecision. He repeatedly postponed the schedule, allowing for smaller problems to become severe. Furthermore, he totally misunderstood the political situation. He thought only a small number of radicals in Paris were promoting a revolution that the people as a whole rejected. He thought, mistakenly, that he was beloved by the peasants and the common folk. The king's flight in the short term was traumatic for France, inciting a wave of emotions that ranged from anxiety to violence to panic. Everyone realized that war was imminent. The deeper realization that the king had in fact repudiated the revolution, was an even greater shock for people who until then had seen him as a good king who governed as a manifestation of God's will. They felt betrayed. Republicanism now burst out of the coffeehouses and became a dominating philosophy of the rapidly radicalized French Revolution.
Intervention by foreign powers.
The other monarchies of Europe looked with concern upon the developments in France, and considered whether they should intervene either in support of Louis or to take advantage of the chaos in France. The key figure was Marie Antoinette's brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II. Initially, he had looked on the revolution with equanimity. However, he became more and more disturbed as it became more and more radical. Despite this, he still hoped to avoid war. On August 27, Leopold and King Frederick William II of Prussia, in consultation with émigrés French nobles, issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, which declared the interest of the monarchs of Europe in the well-being of Louis and his family, and threatened vague but severe consequences if anything should befall them. Although Leopold saw the Pillnitz Declaration as an easy way to appear concerned about the developments in France without committing any soldiers or finances to change them, the revolutionary leaders in Paris viewed it fearfully as a dangerous foreign attempt to undermine France's sovereignty. In addition to the ideological differences between France and the monarchical powers of Europe, there were continuing disputes over the status of Austrian estates in Alsace, and the concern of members of the National Constituent Assembly about the agitation of émigrés nobles abroad, especially in the Austrian Netherlands and the minor states of Germany. In the end, the Legislative Assembly, supported by Louis, declared war on the Holy Roman Empire first, voting for war on April 20, 1792, after a long list of grievances was presented to it by the Foreign Minister, Charles-François de Mauriers. de Maurice prepared an immediate invasion of the Austrian Netherlands, where he expected the local population to rise against Austrian rule. However, the revolution had thoroughly disorganized the army, and the forces raised were insufficient for the invasion. The soldiers fled at the first sign of battle and, in one case, on April 28, 1792, murdered their general, Irish-born Comte Theobald de Dillon, whom they accused of treason. While the revolutionary government frantically raised fresh troops and reorganized its armies, a Prussian-Austrian army under Charles William Ferdinand, Duke of Brunswick assembled at Koblenz on the Rhine. In July, the invasion commenced, with Brunswick's army easily taking the fortresses of Longwy and Verdun. The Duke then issued on July 25 a proclamation called the Brunswick Manifesto, written by Louis's émigré cousin, the Prince de Conde, declaring the intent of the Austrians and Prussians to restore the king to his full powers and to treat any person or town who opposed them as rebels to be condemned to death by martial law. Contrary to its intended purpose of strengthening the position of the king against the revolutionaries, the Brunswick Manifesto had the opposite effect of greatly undermining Louis XVI's already highly tenuous position in Paris. It was taken by many to be the final proof of a collusion between the king and foreign powers in a conspiracy against his own country. The anger of the populace boiled over on August 10 when an armed mob, with the backing of a new municipal government of Paris that came to be known as the insurrectional Paris Commune, besieged the Tuileries Palace. The royal family took shelter with the Legislative Assembly.
Imprisonment and execution, 1792 to 1793.
Louis was officially arrested on August 13, 1792, and sent to the Temple, an ancient fortress in Paris that was used as a prison. On September 21, the National Assembly declared France to be a republic and abolished the monarchy. Louis was stripped of all of his titles and honors, and from this date was known as simply Citoyen Louis Capet. The Girondins were partial to keeping the deposed king under arrest, both as a hostage and a guarantee for the future. Members of the Commune and the most radical deputies, who would soon form the group known as the Mountain, argued for Louis's immediate execution. The legal background of many of the deputies made it difficult for a great number of them to accept an execution without the due process of law of some sort, and it was voted that the deposed monarch be tried before the National Convention, the organ that housed the representatives of the sovereign people. In many ways, the former king's trial represented the trial of the revolution. The trial was seen as such, with the death of one came the life of the other. Michelet argued that the death of the former king would lead to the acceptance of violence as a tool for happiness. He said, "If we accept the proposition that one person can be sacrificed for the happiness of the many, it will soon be demonstrated that two or three or more could also be sacrificed for the happiness of the many. Little by little, we will find reasons for sacrificing the many for the happiness of the many, and we will think it was a bargain." In November 1792, the Armoire de Fer, Iron Chest, incident took place at the Tuileries Palace, when the existence, in the king's bedroom, of the hidden safe containing compromising documents and correspondence, was revealed by François Gamine, the Versailles locksmith who had installed it, went to Paris on November 20 and told Jean-Marie Roland, Girondinist Minister of the Interior. The resulting scandal served to discredit the king. On December 11, among crowded and silent streets, the deposed king was brought from the Temple to stand before the convention and hear his indictment, an accusation of high treason and crimes against the state. On December 26, his counsel, Raymond d'Assise, delivered Louis' response to the charges, with the assistance of François Tronchet and Mailche Bez. On January 15, 1793, the convention, composed of 721 deputies, voted on the verdict. Given overwhelming evidence of Louis's collusion with the invaders, the verdict was a foregone conclusion, with 693 deputies voting guilty, none for acquittal, with 23 abstaining. The next day, a roll call vote was carried out to decide upon the fate of the former king, and the result was uncomfortably close for such a dramatic decision. 288 of the deputies voted against death and for some other alternative, mainly some means of imprisonment or exile. 72 of the deputies voted for the death penalty, but subject to a number of delaying conditions and reservations. 361 of the deputies voted for Louis's immediate death. Philippe Egalite, formerly the Duke of Orleans and Louis' own cousin, voted for Louis' execution, a cause of much future bitterness among French monarchists. The next day, a motion to grant Louis XVI reprieve from the death sentence was voted down. 310 of the deputies requested mercy, but 380 voted for the immediate execution of the death penalty. This decision would be final. On Monday 21 January 1793, Louis XVI was beheaded by guillotine on the Place de la Révolution. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, testified that the former king had bravely met his fate. As Louis XVI mounted the scaffold, he appeared dignified and resigned. He delivered a short speech in which he reasserted his innocence. "I pardon those who are the cause of my death," he declared himself innocent of the crimes he was accused of, praying that his blood would not fall back on France. Many accounts suggest Louis XVI's desire to say more, but Antoine-Joseph Santerre, a general in the National Guard, halted the speech by ordering a drum roll. The former king was then quickly beheaded. Some accounts of Louis's beheading indicate that the blade did not sever his neck entirely the first time. There are also accounts of a blood-curdling scream issuing from Louis after the blade fell, but this is unlikely, since the blade severed Louis's spine. It is agreed that while Louis's blood dripped to the ground, many members of the crowd ran forward to dip their handkerchiefs in it. This account was proven true in 2012 after a DNA comparison linked blood thought to be from Louis XVI's beheading to DNA taken from tissue samples originating from what was long thought to be the mummified head of Henry IV of France. The blood sample was taken from a gourd carved to commemorate the heroes of the French Revolution that had, according to legend, been used to house Louis's blood.
Legacy.
The 19th-century historian Jules Michelet attributed the restoration of the French monarchy to the sympathy that had been engendered by the execution of Louis XVI. Michelet's Histoire de la Révolution française and Alphonse de Lamartine's Histoire des Girondins, in particular, showed the marks of the feelings aroused by the Revolution's regicide. The two writers did not share the same socio-political vision, but they agreed that, even though the monarchy was rightly ended in 1792, the lives of the royal family should have been spared. Lack of compassion at that moment contributed to a radicalization of revolutionary violence and to greater divisiveness among Frenchmen. For the 20th century novelist Albert Camus, the execution signaled the end of the role of God in history, for which he mourned. For the 20th century philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, the regicide was the starting point of all French thought, the memory of which acts as a reminder that French modernity began under the sign of a crime. His daughter, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, the future Duchess of Angoulême, survived the French Revolution, and she lobbied in Rome energetically for the canonization of her father as a saint of the Catholic Church. Despite his signing of the civil constitution of the clergy, Louis had been described as a martyr by Pope Pius VI in 1793. In 1820, however, a memorandum of the Congregation of Rites in Rome, declaring the impossibility of proving that Louis had been executed for religious rather than political reasons, put an end to hopes of canonization. The Requiem in C minor for mixed chorus by Luigi Cherubini was written in 1816, in memory of Louis XVI. The city of Louisville, Kentucky, is named for Louis XVI. In 1780, the Virginia General Assembly bestowed this name in honor of the French king, whose soldiers were aiding the American side in the Revolutionary War. The Virginia General Assembly saw the king as a noble man, but many other Continental delegates disagreed. At that time, Kentucky was a part of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Kentucky became the 15th state of the United States in 1792. There are numerous other places named Louisville, such as Louisville, Alabama, Louisville, Colorado, Louisville, Georgia, Louisville, Illinois, Louisville, Kansas, Louisville, Nebraska, Louisville, New York, Louisville, Ohio, Louisville, Kentucky, and Louisville, Tennessee, all located in the United States.
In film and literature.
King Louis XVI has been portrayed in numerous films. In Marie Antoinette, 1938, He was played by Robert Morley. Jean-François Barmot portrayed him in the 1989 two-part miniseries La Révolution française. More recently, he was depicted in the 2006 film Marie Antoinette by Jason Schwartzman. In XVI of France, Louis was portrayed by one of the film's producers, Gilbert Bokanowski, using the alias Gilbert Boca. Several portrayals have upheld the image of a bumbling, almost foolish king, such as that by Jacques Morel in the 1956 French film Marie Antoinette Reine de France and that by Terence Budd in the Lady Oscar live-action film. In Start the Revolution Without Me, Louis XVI is portrayed by Hugh Griffith as a laughable cuckold. Mel Brooks played a comic version of Louis XVI in The History of the World Part 1, portraying him as a libertine who has such a distaste for the peasantry he uses them as targets in skeet shooting. In 1996 Patrice Leconte made Ridicule, which depicted a court already at odds with its nobles and in terminal decline.
Titles, styles and arms. Titles and styles.
August 23, 1754 – December 20, 1765, His Royal Highness the Duke of Berry, December 20, 1765 – May 10, 1774, His Royal Highness the Dauphin of France, May 10, 1774 – September 21, 1792, His Most Christian Majesty the King, September 21, 1792 – January 21, 1793, Citizen Louis Capet.
Arms. Bibliography.
Banach, Antoine de. From Royal Dignity to Republican Austerity, The Ritual for the Reception of Louis XVI in the French National Assembly, 1789–1792. Journal of Modern History 1994 66, 4, 671–696. JSTOR.org, Burley, Peter. A Bankrupt Regime. History Today, January 1984, 3436–42. ISSN, 0018-2753. Full text in EBSCO, Doyle, William. Origins of the French Revolution, 3rd ed. 1999, online edition, Doyle, William. The Execution of Louis XVI and the End of the French Monarchy. History Review. 2000, pages 21 plus Questia.com, online edition, Doyle, William, 2002. The Oxford History of the French Revolution. UK, Oxford University Press. ISBN 978-0-19-925298-5. Pages 194 to 196 deal with the trial of Louis XVI, Doyle, William, ed. Old Regime France, 2001, Dunn, Susan. The Deaths of Louis XVI, Regicide in the French Political Imagination. 1994. 178 pp. Hardman, John. Louis XVI, The Silent King, 1994, 224 pages, The Standard Scholarly Biography, Hardman, John. French Politics, 1774–1789, From the Accession of Louis XVI to the Fall of the Bastille. 1995. 283 pp. Jones, Colin. The Great Nation, France from Louis XV to Napoleon, 2002, Amazon.com, excerpt and text search, Mignot, François Auguste, 1824. History of the French Revolution from 1789 to 1814 inches. Project Gutenberg. See Chapter 6, The National Convention, for more details on the King's trial and execution. Padova, Saul K. The Life and Death of Louis XVI, 1939, Questia.com, online edition, Price, Munro. The Road from Versailles, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and the Fall of the French Monarchy, 2004, 425 pp. Amazon.com, excerpt and text search. Also published as The Fall of the French Monarchy, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette and the Baron de Breteuil. 2002, Sharma, Simon. Citizens. A Chronicle of the French Revolution, 1989, highly readable narrative by scholar Amazon.com, excerpt and text search, Tackett, Timothy. When the King Took Flight. 2003. 270 pp. Amazon.com, excerpt and text search.
Historiography.
McGill, Frank N. Execution of Louis XVI in McGill's History of Europe, 1993, 3161-4, Moncur, James A. ed. Research Guide to European Historical Biography, 1450-present, 4 vol. 1992, 31193-1213, Riney, Anne. Toward Varens. New Literary History 1986-18, 1, 77-98 and JSTOR, on historiography.
Primary sources.
Marie Antoinette. Memoirs of Marie Antoinette, Queen of France and wife of Louis XVI, Queen of France, 1910, books.google.com, complete edition online. Full text of writings of Louis XV in Ball State University's Digital Media Repository. Revolutionary is interpreted as Louis family name. Louis XVI is the only king of France ever to be executed, and his death brought an end to more than 1,000 years of continuous French monarchy.
Childhood.
Louis Auguste de France, who was given the title Duc de Berry at birth, was born in the Palace of Versailles. Out of 7 children, he was the third son of Louis, the Dauphin of France, and thus the grandson of Louis XV of France and of his consort, Marie Leszczyńska. His mother was Marie Joseph of Saxony, the daughter of Frederick Augustus II of Saxony, Prince-Elector of Saxony and King of Poland. Louis Auguste had a difficult childhood because his parents neglected him in favor of his, said to be, bright and handsome older brother, Louis, Duc de Bourgogne, who died at the age of 9 in 1761. A strong and healthy boy, but very shy, Louis Auguste excelled in his studies and had a strong taste for Latin, history, geography, and astronomy, and became fluent in Italian and English. He enjoyed physical activities such as hunting with his grandfather, and rough playing with his younger brothers, Louis Stanislas, Comte de Provence, and Charles Philippe, Comte de Troyes. From an early age, Louis Auguste had been encouraged in another of his hobbies, locksmithing, which was seen as a useful pursuit for a child. Aristocracy into the absolute monarchy, of which Louis and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, were viewed as representatives. In 1789, the storming of the Bastille during riots in Paris marked the beginning of the French Revolution. Louis's indecisiveness and conservatism led some elements of the people of France to view him as a symbol of the perceived tyranny of the Ancien regime, and his popularity deteriorated progressively. His disastrous flight to Varennes in June 1791, 4 months before the constitutional monarchy was declared, seemed to justify the rumors that the king tied his hopes of political salvation to the prospects of foreign invasion. The credibility of the king was deeply undermined and the abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of a republic became an ever-increasing possibility. In a context of civil and international war, Louis XVI was suspended and arrested at the time of the insurrection of August 10, 1792, 1 month before the constitutional monarchy was abolished in the First French Republic proclaimed on September 21, 1792. He was tried by the National Convention, self-instituted as a tribunal for the occasion, found guilty of high treason, and executed by guillotine on January 21, 1793 as a desacralized French citizen known as Citizen Louis Capet, a nickname in reference to Hugh Capet, the founder of the Capetian dynasty, which the wife, the formidable Empress Maria Theresa. This marriage was met with some hostility by the French public. France's alliance with Austria had pulled the country into the disastrous 7 Years' War, in which it was defeated by the British, both in Europe and in North America. By the time that Louis Auguste and Marie Antoinette were married, the French people generally regarded the Austrian alliance with dislike, and Marie Antoinette was seen as an unwelcome foreigner. For the young couple, the marriage was initially amiable but distant. Louis Auguste's shines and, among other factors, the young age and inexperience of the newlyweds, who were near total strangers to each other, having met only 2 days prior to their wedding, meant that the 15-year-old bridegroom failed to consummate the union with his 14-year-old bride. His fear of being manipulated by her for imperial purposes caused him to behave coldly towards her in public. Over time, the couple became closer, though while their marriage was reportedly consummated in July 1773, it was not in fact really so until 1777. Nevertheless, the royal couple failed to produce any children for several years after their wedding, placing a strain upon their marriage, whilst the situation was worsened by the publication of obscene pamphlets, libels, which mocked the infertility of the pair. One questioned, "Can the king do it?"
Louis XVI of France.
Louis XVI was King of France and Navarre from 1774 until 1791, after which he was subsequently King of the French from 1791 to 1792, before his deposition and execution during the French Revolution. His father, Louis, Dauphin of France, was the son and heir apparent of Louis XV of France. As a result of the Dauphin's death in 1765, Louis succeeded his grandfather in 1774. The first part of Louis' reign was marked by attempts to reform France in accordance with Enlightenment ideals. These included efforts to abolish serfdom, remove the taille, and increase tolerance toward non-Catholics. The French nobility reacted to the proposed reforms with hostility, and successfully opposed their implementation. Increased discontent among the common people ensued. From 1776 Louis XVI actively supported the North American colonists, who were seeking their independence from Great Britain, which was realized in the 1783 Treaty of Paris. The ensuing debt and financial crisis contributed to the unpopularity of the Ancien regime, which culminated at the Estates General of 1789. Discontent among the members of France's middle and lower classes resulted in strengthened opposition to the French. Upon the death of his father, who died of tuberculosis on December 20, 1765, the 11-year-old Louis Auguste became the new Dauphin. His mother never recovered from the loss of her husband, and died on March 13, 1767, also from tuberculosis. The strict and conservative education he received from the Duc de la Vallée-Guyon, Gouverneur des Enfants de France, Governor of the Children of France, from 1760 until his marriage in 1770, did not prepare him for the throne that he was to inherit in 1774 after the death of his grandfather, Louis XV. Throughout his education, Louis Auguste received a mixture of studies particular to religion, morality, and humanities. His instructors may have also had a good hand in shaping Louis Auguste into the indecisive king that he became. Abbé Berthier, his instructor, taught him that timidity was a value in strong monarchs, and Abbé Soldini, his confessor, instructed him not to let people read his mind.
Family life.
On May 16, 1770, at the age of 15, Louis Auguste married the 14-year-old Habsburg Archduchess Maria Antonia, better known by the French form of her name, Marie Antoinette, his second cousin once removed and the youngest daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Francis I and his wife.